Anyway, we were talking about the the ambiance of the show and the period and the events. Now, when you figure that this Josie Wales, like the Wild Bunch, covered a great period of time, it's in a true sense a saga. Uh, there's a definite period identification that the music ought to put down. That is not to say that the score to Josie Wales is an old-fashioned score. It's a Western score, a typical Western score in many ways, but it's what I would call about as modern in the in the tonal symphonic sense as I've ever been able to get in a score, and yet it works for this period picture because there's a giant manipulation going on. But the fact remains that it's still, while it is a modern and very dissonant score, it belongs where you see it. The next problem is to establish the fact that the architecture has to be served. What is the way the tale is told? Is there one climax, two, three? What are you working towards? Where are you at your apex? Where are you coming back? Where have you finished? What is the major thing to do? Is it in three acts, one act? Is it a one-dimensional thing that goes one way? Are there left turns? Are there surprises? Is it all predictable? What? When you make this master plan, in effect, and I speak figuratively, you really draw the basic shape of it in your mind, and you have to decide whether it's going to be a melodic score, a 12-tone score, a dissonant score, a polytonal score. What is the best hardware that will serve this end? And is it a lot of action? Is there a lot of interaction between people? Is there a lot of character study to do? Is there tension? What are you doing, in other words? And when you decide that, as I say, you build this thing. Well, the Josie Wales score begins with the tale begins with an outrage which occurs in the first act, the first thing you see, and then the establishment of the theatrical piece, and the entire picture from then on takes you through a series of events which lead to the point where the outrage is avenged at the end of the picture. The whole purpose of this entire picture is to undo the initial outrage or to avenge it. And so it all relates in that way. It's not exactly a chase. As he goes along, he picks up people on this odyssey with him. And so frequently you have added new characters. You have the Indian, you have the old woman, the young girl, the dog, an Indian girl he picks up. And soon it's a whole group. But as each element is added, some of the anger of the assembly is somewhat mitigated, and he becomes emotionally involved with these people, and he's derailed a little bit from the single-mindedness of his purpose, which is simply to cut a guy's throat, who killed his wife and kids, and his viewpoint broadens, and I think that if you the album, which is available, that some of this is apparent on there. The picture starts out with a very descriptive piece, which kind of goes right with the initial thing. It was rather horrifying. And then the main title, which in fact is a real Confederate Army song. It's a one. I got it out of an ancient collection of fife and drum songs of the Confederate Army, first published I think in 1790 in that form. But the song itself is really a reel, imported from Ireland or Scotland. I don't know which. So many songs in this country, in the Appalachian regions, and in the South, and even in the North, were old Anglo-Saxon airs. I mean, I'm talking about Danny Boy and all the rest of them, and half the sea chanties, and Who Will Tie Your Shoes, and all those songs are all old, reworked. Even the song, the reels, the square dance things were all old English folk songs for the most part. Some French too. And so, like in Mexico, you'll find in Mexican music that there's a great deal of Austrian influence, Irish. It was at one time they were all conquerors there, and they always brought that with them. So I chose this one thing because it had a certain kind of, I don't know, abandon, impertinence, that kind of cocky feeling that a bunch of never-give-up rebels would have. It's got a lot of macho in it, and it's very exciting. and it served the picture well, and it starts and ends the picture. Also, the same music which occurred under the prior scene, which was the initial event, reoccurs at the end in that very exciting chase when he finally chases down the guy who did it and does him in. But along the way, there are various things that happen. The Indian gets introduced, and there's an introduction of a great deal of American Indian music. Now, there's a story again. I have researched Indian music till I'm blue in the face for a series of pictures I've done. Shadow's Land, Sam's Picture, this thing, many westerns. And I got to tell you, for me personally, and I don't mean this as an insult to anyone, I don't really find American Indian music very listenable. From all the tribes, there are many albums of their tribal music, and it's interesting. It really is interesting, but it's really not very listenable because our ears are not tuned to those scales, if indeed they are scales, and their rhythms are very diffuse. They're terribly scrapey in most cases, and really difficult for our ears to use in a form that is palatable, really. It's just like to an East Indian, if you played him a Beethoven symphony, he would say, well, it sounds just like the Tchaikovsky first to him, just like to us all ragas sound very much the same, because to Indian ears, they evolve differently. You can't sit in a kabuki theater in Japan like they can for 5 hours and remain glued and interested any more than they can watch a Wagnerian Meistersinger for 5 hours and fail to fall asleep. So we're just not tuned into American Indian music. But in researching Sam's Wild Bunch, I found the study that Carlos Chavez did on the Yaqui, which are Mexican Indians, because of certain artifacts they undug. They dug up, one of which was a series of clay flutes, 3 in a row, that produced a chord, and several other clay instruments the Yaqui had. They had the instruments, they had no idea what they did with them. How could they? Nobody wrote it down. There were no tape recorders in those days. And the Yaqui who played them were gone. There was some evidence, however, from the ones who were left as to what it might have been. And Carlos Chavez did this study, and he did, in fact, a reverse analysis, a most interesting kind of research. He took Mexican Indian music as it is known to be today and simply evolved it backwards by, just prognosticating what the changes that it went through were and allowing what he found out could be played on these instruments and the kind of rhythms and pitches and things that survived in the Indian lore. He kind of took a guess at what the chance, what they used them for. And it's a marvelous study. And that music I found quite lovely in many ways. And it really says Indian to you. And the use of ankle bells and certain other bells and things they use, certain other percussion instruments. There was even one stringed instrument that they had, which is kind of in the register of the viola. Largely the Apache had them. And from this study, although the music is supposed to be Yaqui music, and the Indian in this case was a Cherokee, that's a liberty I just took. I figured, well, Cherokee music is unbearable, and who's going to know, so you do. It worked. I mean, when Chief Dan George appeared, and whatever it is we're playing, although he wasn't dressed with a feather and a loincloth, there was no question but what he's an American Indian in the audience's mind, and that's really the objective. So there's all of that. And then there's the business with the girl, which is somewhat self-consciously warm, because Josie Wales is not a man who's a romantic figure. But he had a love affair going with a rather strange girl. And then, again, like the Wild Bunch, there was this hidden byplay always between the hunter and the hunted. Did they really hate each other all that much? Or was there any respect at all between them? And when the moment of truth came and the time came to really shed the blood, they really didn't do it. Time had somewhat worn away the intensity of the hatred, and they just, that's something that happens to human people, and that's the part of the picture I really like the best. That's what the Wild Bunch is really all about. And that's what Josie is about in some degree, although one of the heavy villains certainly does get done in, but the other one doesn't. And at the point when they meet face to face, they're both down and out, and they know they've all lost, and there's no point to going on with this and shedding any more blood, and so they don't. And you're left up in the air as to whether Josie goes back to the girl or dies, because he is wounded and you see him bleeding at that point. And we never answer that question. I like a lot of things it says. It is testimony to some of the aspects of the human spirit which I find rather uplifting. I would far rather be involved in doing that, say, than doing a picture about exorcism, or a dope pusher, or a super cop. You know what I mean?
Let's see. You had a big band at one time.
Oh boy, did I! Yes.
Talk about that for a while.
Well.
When did you? We were 17 when you.
I
got into
came
bands?
I came from the band era, which was the swing era. We used to call it the swing era. We now known as the era of the big bands. Christ knows when actually it began. I suppose American popular music as we know it. You got to remember that it's quite new. At the turn of the century, as late as 1918, World War One. There were no phonographs. There were actually in 1910, actually 1908, but they were the cylindrical ones on those early Edison machines, and everybody didn't have one. The quality wasn't too good. There was no radio, and what served for popular music, other than folk music and reels and dances that people did in the geographical locations where they were, there was hillbilly music and whatever. What was really popular music? There were minstrel shows, and there was, for a while, vaudeville. There hadn't evolved the musical theater yet. The operetta was there. The opera was certainly there. It had been imported from Europe, and all the symphony stuff. But as popular songs go, the early records that were made were largely novelties from the minstrel shows, banjo players and guys that did novel things, trombone solos and amusing kind of interesting things that were done in that, and in early vaudeville, and marching bands. There were a lot of marching bands, and the first records were largely those things. Then, during World War I, when Irving Berlin surfaced, the popular song began to take form. And then the operetta turned into the musical, and it became less and less opera-ish and more, stage play-ish. And we had No, Nanette and Rosemary and all those things, and that became a very big item. And that's really a truly American form. Then, in the 20s, came along a different kind of an improvement in the recording process, and the era of Prohibition, and the first of the dance bands, which grew out of the Dixieland bands and ballroom dancing, and all that occurred. And then we had Paul Whiteman and Abe Lyman after the original Dixie groups came, and it's an interesting evolution. But as it went, the groups got bigger. They just got bigger. They started out as glorified Dixieland bands. At one time, there used to be 50 and 60 men playing dances in Washington, D.C. and in Philadelphia and those places. Great, big, huge amounts of playing for waltzing around. But then, early wireless came in. I remember the first pop records that came out. There were on those big, thick Edison records, and then there was the regular wax ones, and then there was some on cardboard that you could get in the dime store for 75 cents, which were, the quickies. There were all kinds of things. And we passed through all those phases, and it fell into its own. And then into the 30s, the bands really began to take shape as something really quite to be reckoned with seriously. The saxophone was not a toy anymore. It stopped sounding like some poor kid, with colic. And it began to sound like an instrument, and people began to accept this as not an entirely worthless or cheesy form of something to do. The early jazz artists were suddenly recognized. Already they were dead. Beiderbecke was already gone, but they were recognized as perhaps something went by there that we didn't really appreciate when it was going. But we still had guys like Art Tatum and the Lunsford Band, and it was a very exciting time. And the arrangers first came into their own then. People stopped making things up and began to write them down. The bands began to get organized a little bit. And ensemble playing began to fall together. And in short, something began to grow, and just like a a planet, from galactic dust, just from interacting on itself, begins to take shape and form itself into a star. And radio was a great help to this, as were all the ballrooms and the economy of the time and the feeling of the country at the time. And I think it reached its first apex about the time Benny Goodman did the first Carnegie Hall concert. I think you'd have to say that was the Woodstock of the big band era. That was what put it on the map. That's what made it respectable. Benny Goodman was in Carnegie Hall with a swing band, and he tore the roof off the world. Now, you wouldn't remember this, but as I recall in those days, and I do recall them very well, the popularity of that music to the American people at that time had a far broader reach than rock music has, because the fans for swing music extended from the oldest to the very youngest. Everybody. And it was not the property of any generation. Classical music was, and the operetta was, and country music was set aside a little bit. It was there. And black music was. It was there, too. Let's call them race records. And they were very similar to what we now call rock records. But they were there in the 26. But they were isolated for a certain group. But the bands were everybody's interest. And you found them in all the movies and on all the best shows. And everybody knew who Tommy Dorsey was. And everybody knew who Benny Goodman was. And everybody knew who Woody Herman was. And they all came and stood in line to see them when they came in town, and it was a marvelous time. And after the peak, as always with an era, when it flowers, it blooms, it's avant-garde to a point when something happens and it suddenly becomes accepted by everybody. It's no longer avant-garde, it is now pop art. And it begins its long period of decline when the imitators come in and everybody begins to try and be like somebody who's already done the innovation. Then we had the Glenn Millers and the Tommy Tuckers and all the imitation bands. And it was a long period of decline. This is the way it works. It always works this way. There's always, a point before the great popularity, which is the great point. When the popularity occurs, then you're in a period of slow decay. And that's when it becomes popular, because by the time the broad mass of people catches up with it, its flower of youth is gone. That's true in your relationship with the world, mine, and everybody else's. So then I was, the war hadn't broken yet, and I was a music student in junior high school, and I signed up for the band. I wanted to play the trombone. I had flopped out as a fiddle player at age 4. My father had seen Yehudi Menuhin and thought, well, Jesus, I'll buy my kid a fiddle, maybe he'll surprise me. But I'm afraid I was a disappointment to my father. I didn't do well on the violin at 4 years old. And he became very discouraged and never encouraged it again. But like all people at the time, I was caught up in this new thing, which, boy, it really hooked us all. And I wanted to play the trombone, and they didn't have any trombones. They were out of them for that semester, I guess. All they had was clarinet, so that's what I got. And I started studying that I think I was 11 years old, something like that. And nobody took it very seriously, but I did surprisingly well, even to my own surprise. Within a year, they had me going to Carnegie Tech on Saturdays to those kind of precocious classes for precocious young brats that show promise. I was studying with the clarinet player at the Pittsburgh Symphony, which was then becoming a big orchestra. Reiner had just taken it over from. It was the first major conductor, and the orchestra was making a run for the big time, which it has made, by the way, and long since too. And the thought was that I was going to train to become a legitimate clarinet player, but I got sick. I fell apart at about 14, I guess. 13, really. Maybe even a little before that, I don't remember. And I was working nights in the drugstore. In Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, at that time, you got to remember, existed under a cloud of bituminous coal dust and freezing, dirty air. Every kid that came from there has tubercular marks on his lungs, and it was a rotten place to be at that time. It was before it was cleaned up at all. It was a combination of the mills were in the valley along the rivers. The residential areas where us upper middle crust fellas lived, those of us who were lucky enough to do that, was on top of the hill, as it always is in a town like that. The top of the hill is on an even plane with the top of the smokestacks, so that the poison would come out of the smokestacks and drift right across the wealthiest part of town. The people down in the hollow never got it. But it was murder, I want to tell you. And I really was no match for it. I weighed about 40 pounds when I was 14 years old. And I caught every disease that came along. And I was working very hard because I was paying for my own lessons and very serious about matters. I even started a little band, which we used to rehearse every night at somebody's house, walk for 3 miles to get there. And I came apart. And after 2 years of that, I just wasn't about to go back and start playing again. I couldn't face going back to if I had no chops and no fingers, and to start all over again was just such a discouraging thing. I'd put in so much work, and it was all shot. So I really was in a bad place. But while I was in bed all that time recovering, I wasn't allowed to do much but listen to the radio. That's really all there was to do. And I heard all the bands all day and all night, because then there was every 15 minutes there was a remote from some hotel or some location somewhere, and it was all so glamorous and all so new. I heard the old Orson Welles broadcast when the invasion from all of that. I heard the original ones, and I really got so hooked on this, and I became conscious of the fact that there were people writing music for these things and for the bands, that it had to be done by somebody. And even Fred Waring was, I guess, one of the first guys to make arrangers face people with faces and names. And so Tommy Dorsey with Cy Oliver and all. And I really began to get interested in that end of it, so that when I got well, I didn't want to go back to the instrument again. I went immediately into the study of trying to learn how to write. And there was a man in Pittsburgh who had the Stanley Theater Pit Orchestra. His name was Max Atkins, quite a marvelous man. He had a lot of students. He taught saxophone, clarinet, and arranging, harmony, all that stuff. And he was a swinging young fella with a good band. He had a radio show. Henry Mancini was with him. Billy May was there. I think Roy Eldridge was in that place for a while. A lot of people. And since he had the pit orchestra and theater where all the bands came through, it was good to be in with him, because when you got good enough, all the bands knew him and he knew them, and he would place people with these bands as they came through. And about 6-7 months after I'd been with him, I had written a couple of things that he thought had some merit, and he showed them to Alvino Ray. He said, "I think you're ready now." And they came through. Alvino Ray was in that week with the King Sisters, and he said, "I got a kid here who's written some stuff. Why don't you run it? I think you'd be interested." And I did, and they hired me. And I went with them. I was 17 and a half, and I've never been back since. Then I went through that whole period in the war, and with the band, out of the band, back with it again, up to New York. And through that period of staying in New York, writing for everybody, whoever you could, then the band came out here twice. Second time it came out here, it stayed here. The band disbanded here. And I stayed also, and I began to look for. It was a different world then. You got to remember this. There were 3 ballrooms in this town functioning full time, 4, and big name bands coming through every week. And there was a lot to do. Radio was a big deal. There was a lot of live performing. There were live acts to work for. A lot of nightclubs going right here in town. There were things to do that aren't there now. Like for actors, there used to be the mountains in New York where you could train and learn. No more. But I had been with the bands a long time by then. For me, 5 years is a long time. And gradually I started with vocal groups. I picked up a group called the Town Criers. I started working with them. They wound up with Kay Kaiser on the Kay Kaiser College of Musical Knowledge, big radio show. And I went to work on that with them. And then George Dooning, who was head arranger for that show, got drafted. I'd already been thrown out because of my physical messy condition. And guess who got his job? I wasn't ready for it, but I got it. So there we were doing an hour show a week and a show a day in a different place in this country every day, riding on the road. That show ate up at least 20 minutes of arrangements a week. There was just sheer music that I had to write. And boy, the requirements of having to do that when you're that young, and it's got to be used, and you're going to hear it, and it's got to be right, and you can't crap around too much. That's the best training in the world, you know. And if you're going to strike out, they're going to grind you to dust. And if you don't, then you're going to learn something. And I must say that I'm very grateful for that period because I learned a great deal. I learned a great deal about broadcast techniques, about about audio techniques and acoustics and the techniques of writing. And I tried a lot of new things. I was always doing stuff that no one tried before. And it was a good band. I was in that job for quite a few years until I got to be about 26 or 27. No, it was before that. I don't know, maybe 24 maybe. I can't remember the year even. When I walked in someplace said I wanted to be a leader. And they said, yeah, well, we'll call you sometime. And a year later they did because as luck would have it, a new comic came along was going to replace Jack Benny in a summer replacement show on radio. And he wanted all new people. And he had all new people. New announcers, new comics, new writers, no names. And he wanted a young band leader. There weren't any. So somebody in this agency, who happened to be Jennings Lang, as a matter of fact, was Mike Lang's father, now with MCA, remembered that this creep walked in off the street one day and said, I want to be a leader. And he found me. I was in New York with Kaiser, and he said, you know, I got a show if you want to do it. I don't know. And I quit Kaiser on the spot and came back, and that was my first radio show as a conductor, and that was Jack Parr in the summer of 1946 or 47, I can't remember. Anyway, from there, you know, you go on in radio from one show to another. I wound up with many, many radio shows doing more and more dramatic music throughout Lux Radio Theater, Chicken Every Sunday, Life of Riley, Hardy Family, and quiz shows like the Groucho Marx Show for 6 years, all that kind of junk. But as I had come here and dropped off, the band's era was beginning to come to its conclusion too, and more the players I had known in those days were also dropping off here. It was warm, it was a nice place to sit, and they were all dropping off in town and joining this union and waiting to become studio musicians, which they did. Pretty soon it became apparent to me that we had a collection of the greatest jazz band players in the world right here. And we were all bored to death because we had not much to do. This went on into the early 50s. And so I wrote some things for the guys, and we started rehearsing at the union just for like laughs. And maybe on Saturday I'd ask Bobby Phillips to book us for a dance someplace, and just for old time's sake we'll go down and see what we could do. Well, I want to tell you, that thing got out of hand. You know, the band got very good. You got a squeak here somewhere. I mean, we're talking about eternity and the whole world of time and space. I don't know. There's so much to cover.
You were telling me about the copyright law and the networks. That's a very controversial issue.
The new copyright law?
Yeah.
I'm not an expert on the new copyright law. I don't know anybody that is. I was reading an article in the new High Fidelity magazine by Leonard Feist where he tried, it's so new yet. We all have feelings about it. Everybody has an opinion about it. My feeling is that it's already outmoded. I think the whole concept is outmoded, but I think so many present concepts are outmoded. We are being caught up in the advancing technology very fast in many ways. For example, the situation in the industry, in the media concerning contracts with unions, which provide the basic contract provides so many men for such and such a job. Like a dubbing crew in the IA, for example. There's a first-class picture. The prerequisite is so many men on the stage, and a loader, and a recordist, and so many mixers. You have to have that. And that was all fine. That's all good. I'm in favor of that kind of thing. However, we come to the time now when there are computerized boards. You don't need 3 mixers anymore. You don't need a loader at all. You don't need a dummy, and you don't need a recordist. With what I have seen that is presently available, one man can dub a picture in one afternoon and combine 45 tracks from one chair, and do it better and quicker. But they can't. It's not allowed to be done. You can do it, but you have to pay the standby crew to stand there and pick their noses while you do. Same is true with the musicians' union and the synthesizers. For years, they were not allowed because they replaced human beings, and that was the job of the union, to protect jobs. All of that's good, but we are coming upon a point where the development of technology the development of the structure of society is not keeping abreast of the technology. There's been too much technology since the end of World War II for us to assimilate in such a short space of time. As you well know, the computer age and what they're learning about everything, including genetics and outer space and chemistry and physics and pollution, all of it. You know, we can't. It's human beings are not up to the challenge, I'm afraid, and we are coming up against another, a crash. I feel that's just my feeling. Another simple thing is the advent. I was pointing out the videotape recorder to you before. Presently, the FCC has a ban on these things. The reason is that people, like up here, everybody has the Z channel, and they pays their $16 a month, and they don't go to the movies anymore because eventually it's all on there. It's something for a week. Everybody's videotaping the Z channel without commercials, and everybody up here has libraries of cassettes of all the feature films. Well, when you show a feature film on television, there are certain residual payments made to the author, to the director, to the producer, to the certain actors, to the composer, BMI and ASCAP. How in the hell are you going to log a playing of a videotape private cable television? I mean, is that a public performance anyway? There's that question, which is not settled in the new copyright law. That's one of the things I think already outmodes it, because the concept of royalty payments for public performances for profit is already over the hill. As long as you have cable television, what constitutes a public performance? Is private cable or subscription television a public performance, or isn't it? And that's the big question that has yet to be answered. Now, if it is answered, then we have to answer all the subsequent questions and the dust which that one kicks up. What do we do with our rights collection societies and the structure of royalty payments and the question of contracts with so-called feather bedding clauses, which is a dirty word? But how are we going to reconcile all this? See, but nobody seems to be giving that much thought any more than they're thinking as they are inventing synthesizers and keyboards that work off of computers, as you saw in last Sunday's Times or the week before, whatever. That article about that fellow that has the thing with all the presets, and you push two dials, and it'll give you, 4 symphonies and two Hindemith concertos. What are we doing about musicians? What's going to happen to the symphony orchestra? How are we going to be able to afford to sustain in a city a symphony orchestra at a cost that will make it pay its way when, as we know now, there isn't an American symphony left that has a contract with an American recording company? Not one. They're all recording for European or Japanese or some, because the American record companies don't see the profit in it. So, it's just a question of there is a basic going to be what I consider to be what I see as an unavoidable collision, a calamitous collision with regard to a reshuffling and a repositioning of our sense of values with regard to things. And one of the major catastrophes in the offing is going to be the whole area of the arts, because the arts, as presently constituted, are nothing but a means for certain corporate structures to compile enormous profits, and that's the purpose of it. Well, historically and traditionally, that's not what the arts are for at all. But at present, that's all they're for. And that's why I think we have no meaningful young novelists or playwrights or painters or essayists or composers. We have a lot of rock and roll composers and a lot of guitar players and a lot of rock and roll millionaires, and I say power to them, but where are the artists? Where is this age, this particular epoch, this era, where are its contributors to the historical kind of art and art forms that we saw in the first half of the century? I mean, where is our John Steinbeck? Where is our Pablo Picasso? Where is he? Where's Igor Stravinsky? Where's our Bela Bartok? There isn't one. There isn't even an egg with one sticking his head through. And as long as the public school system considers that the humanities and the arts are expendable, we're breeding generation upon generation of potential computer programmers who don't have the ability to to view with any kind of an eye or to develop criteria for being able to assimilate or appreciate any artistic output. They can't tell you whether a thing is a well-constructed, well-crafted piece of non-objective art or a gorilla throwing a bucket of paint at a canvas. They won't know the difference. And they don't know the Blue Danube Waltz, and they never heard of Jascha Heifetz, and that's it. So what else is new? Do you agree?
Yeah. I remember when I was in school.
Where did you go to public school?
I went to school in New York.
What year?
Through 5th grade, and that was 1962.
Did you have music appreciation classes in
Yes.
elementary school?
Yes.
Amazing. We did in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, too, but not as late as 1952. It stopped in the 40s.
And then when I moved out, we moved out here in '62, and I remember in junior high school, we had you had to take a music appreciation
Yes.
class. We learned all
Right.
about the various classical music.
Right. When I come from a town where...
And that was as late as '63,
Yeah.
'64.
in New York. Or here.
That was here.
Here. Well, it's not there now, I'm going to tell you. There's no...
I'm glad I went to school when I did.
Yes, sure. I would think so. However, I sense, I got to tell you, to be not entirely negative, which is stupid, but I must tell you that in the last year I sense a reawakening in a certain element of university students. And because of the mail I'm getting, the calls I'm getting, the requests I'm getting, and the interviews that are requested of me in this last 5 months that were not being requested 5 months ago, suddenly, and rather suddenly I must say, there seems to be a reawakening of interest in a kind of movie score that isn't being done too much anymore, which is the kind that, that I like to try and do all the time if I can. And a more serious kind of ride. I attribute that to two things. One, the kids who made it fast in the rock business before they were 20, learning to do what they could do, which was saleable, are now probably 36 years old. They've learned a little more. They've gotten more proficient, and they've tired of the limitations of that idiom, and they're no longer sneering at everything else in the world. I got to tell you, I understand that because where I come from, I did it also. I started in this business at 17 years old with the big bands, okay? I went to Carnegie Tech. I was being trained to be a legitimate musician, but I left there after 2 weeks because I got a hell of a job with a traveling dance band that I knew about, and it was a good one. And you don't turn that down, and I went. But at the time, I was an awful snob about jazz and swing versus the other kind of music. The hell with that was over. There was nothing in the world for me but this. And for years of my life, I devoted myself to that. And as I grew older and as that faded away and I drifted from one series of things to another or evolved or elevated or whatever you want to change and wound up in the media not too much later, and the requirements to know more than I knew were there before me. I suddenly found myself working in radio, which soon became television, and the necessity to compose was soon upon me, and to do the kind of music that was much more involved than what I had been doing and what I had mastered. And the necessity to go back and pick up all those things I didn't learn was really there, and I had to go do it, and I did it. And I'm glad I did it. And now I realize, from where I am, from the perspective I now stand, that you have to know a great deal about a lot of things. You cannot. It always amazes me in today's world. You see arrangers who you see the records that come out. The strings arranged by Sam Schwartz and the strings of brass by somebody else, or so and so did the rhythm parts. That always I gotta laugh at this. Why do they need 3 guys to make an orchestration? If either you can do it or you can't. If you know how to write for guitars and that's all you know how to write for, I wouldn't want to guess where you'll be in 12 years from now. It's a flimsy thread to base a career on. But I do think that those kids are who started out very clannish and introspective and somewhat bigoted about it, and putting everything down but what they did, which everybody does for a period of time, have grown up and are now discovering a great many other things. when they eventually want to start composing instead of songwriting, I mean composing, they understand and they get wind of the fact that there is a lot to learn. You know, there is the whole craft of counterpoint. There's the whole question of harmony, whether ancient, classical, modern, experimental, whatever. There is the avant-garde, which is wide open. There is the now presently accepted concept that music does not have to be a series of oscillations that come only from where someone once said they ought to come from. Almost any sound is acceptable now as an original source usable in a form. It began back in the old musique concrète thing in the 40s, you know, the first time that ever happened. But now with the electronic things that have come and the devices we are free to do marvelous things now that no prior generation was ever able to do. To me, there is a new wave of tools and a new bag full of hardware that's going to evolve in the next. I hesitate to say how long. If history or the development of society proceeds at a rate of speed anywhere near like what it has been, I would have to say that next 300 years. But I then again have to say that that's not necessarily so, because since the end of World War II, things seem to move at a very accelerated rate. It no longer takes that much time to communicate ideas around the world as it used to. You know, with the satellite, somebody does something in Hong Kong and you know it within the hour. It used to take 2 years, you know. So I don't know. The change might come faster than we think, but I do feel that whatever the musical reflection of the future society and order will be, it will not be as it has been. It will not resemble what we have had. And if I were asked to prognosticate what it would be, I would have to say that it would tend to be more towards what the society is turning into, which is a technology-oriented society, and a less and less and less romantic and less impressionist and more hard, uglier probably, much more electronic and much more scientifically correct and valid. And I think the closest composer around today that I would say is leaning hard in that direction is not very well known to most people. He certainly is the avant-garde, but he has done tremendous work along those lines because he has taken an entirely new approach and used it in what I consider to be a valid artistic fashion. He has made poetic statements with electronic devices, and that's Karlheinz Stockhausen. For my money, he's the only one. There may be others of which I do not know, but he's the only one I know among the established composers who has gone into the use of electronics and come up with something that is more than novelty, and a hell of a lot more than novelty. I mean, there's considerable artistic substance in what Stockhausen is putting out. So I think we have that to look forward to, but we are not preparing for it. I mean, there's a generation of children who are not only not getting music appreciation, not electric music appreciation, they're getting no music appreciation. They don't even know how to pick up on Mozart, let alone Stockhausen. You know,
Most of them probably don't even know who Mozart is.
yeah. So the avant-garde is getting farther and farther avant. You know, will we ever catch up with them? Must always be an avant-garde. There has to be there must always be radicals. You must always preserve the right of radicals, you know, I feel, because if you don't have extremists, you don't have any center, you know. Unless you have periphery, you don't have anything else. You can't tell where you are if you don't know where the fence is. So we need radicals. We need them. We need fools to go out there and experiment and fall on their faces and get burned and hurt and bruised and try things. And if they get lucky, then they become saints. But they lead us. They are going into untried territory, and thank God somebody's trying. We'd never follow if they didn't. But a great deal of the avant-garde is indeed rubbish. You know, experiment for experiment's sake is not always art, nor science. Somebody said that he who works in a research laboratory, he who researches, wastes 98% of his time, and that's true. A researcher, an experimenter, wastes an awful lot of time trying, you know, till you find what works. And then the trick is to be able to pick the wheat from the chaff and develop it, and then begin to make it palatable to people. But I think that even when you listen to the to the attempts of certain more traditional composers, like contemporary ones, like Luciano Berio, whose Symphonia is probably the only work I've heard for traditional symphony orchestra which is truly representative of these times. Uh, when you listen to it and you realize, yes, it's valid, it's true, it's correct, it's what a 20th century composer in the middle of this century must write if he's going to be honest. And it is, but it's ugly, and it's a sick picture of ourselves. It's not pleasant. It's not a nice evening's entertainment. But neither is a look at the world, I want to tell you. The 7 o'clock news is not a nice evening's entertainment, and that's what it's about. And we're living in one of those times, and I just don't happen to be a camel. I'm not a person who is an escapist or nor am I interested in hypnotizing people into not looking at what's wrong, or saying, well, don't worry about it, it's just going to all be fine, we're just going to have a good time, folks, and we're going to laugh and scratch and forget your troubles, come on, get happy. That's not me, man. In fact, I think that we have no more time for those kind of people. If I felt that, I'd either go into the sports business or I'd rent the Coliseum for the weekend, and I would stage frontal lobotomies and drawing and quartering and sell it out and become a millionaire, because people would stand in line to watch bloodshed these days, just the way they did in the Roman Empire. I'm getting that idea. When I see people standing in line to see pictures like the Sentinel and other grisly spectacles, as though this was some kind of a representation of art on film, I have to weep for what's become of the idiom, because the film is a sensational medium, possibly the most marvelous device for human communication ever devised or or conceivable, really. You can capture there the most marvelous things, and it's possible to do, as we well know. But people stand in line to see the Sentinel. They don't stand in line to see Louis Malle pictures, or Bergman pictures, or Peckinpah pictures, or whatever. So I don't know. I'm not terribly optimistic, and I'm somewhat, I guess, I think I'm a realist. Some people say I'm bitter. Some people say I'm no fun at all. But I've been around a while, and I choose to see things as they are. I don't believe in hypnosis or narcosis, and I think that the matter has to be faced.
How about how about your opinion on some of the movies that you've scored lately?
Well, it all comes back to the same thing. Somebody's going to say, well, if this jackass is going to talk like this and tell us all how it's going to be, how come, he's in the commercial film business? I mean, if he's that pure and that uncorruptible, what's he doing this rubbish? My answer to that is I am not that pure, and I am only as incorruptible as I can afford to be and still eat. I consider that I am uncorruptible because there are a lot of things I could have done and have chosen not to do, and my whole life and my history during the blacklist period and everything else is testimony to that. I'm quite sanguine about it. But within the confines of other realisms, there are things I must do to feed my family. Therefore, I work for the industry, and I do the best I can. I am not free to give you an opinion of the pictures I am given to do or that hire me to do them. They hire me not on the basis of whether I like it, or they don't ask me what I would change or what I think of it, although we usually get into those kind of discussions. But the fact remains I'm hired to do the music, and all I'm supposed to tell them is if I think that it's a kind of a thing I can do and want to do. And if I don't, I turn it down. And there are other factors, too. There are other considerations in this thing. Now, a lot of the pictures I've done, a great many of them I would like to take away from the people who've done them and redo them and make what I think they should be, and I maintain in my, bald-faced honesty that I could improve some of them, because I think there have been terrible things come out that I've been connected with that I have no control over. You must remember that no film composer has control even over his own work. We have no control over what they eventually do with what we record. They can throw it out, they can fragment it, they can cut it, they can dial it in and dial it out, and put the second half of it before the first half, and after the preview they can get frightened and shift it all around. I've just been through an experience like this with a film called Demon Seed, which I would dearly like to get my name removed from, where I did one score and then went back and did another one because while they finally bought the concept of the first one, they got panicked by what happened at the preview, and they lost all their courage and sold out and paid me a whole lot of money to come back and write a wrong music, which I didn't want to do, but I was kind of bound to. However, that's unfortunately I can say that the predictions came so. The picture is not doing well. But I'm not going to talk negatively about the bad pictures. I've done some films which I consider among the best films ever made in all ways, and I think the prime example, and I consider myself extremely lucky to have been involved with it, was The Wild Bunch, which to me is almost a perfect movie looking at it from any angle. There's not a frame of that film that I can't look at every day of my life and not see something new in it. That's one of those rare places. I think Straw Dogs was another terribly good picture of Peckinpah. I think Junior Bonner was a very good little movie. I think Josie Wales was a hell of a movie. I don't think it's a classic film, but I think it's a hell of a movie. And considering that Clint Eastwood is as yet a new director, he's making strides that are really should be watched because the man is growing by leaps and bounds, and he started late in life. And for an actor like Clint, without the training that most directors claim to have in his early life, to be doing what he's doing is truly a revelation. And I have the greatest admiration for him. And I would really stand here and predict that inside of 6 years, he's going to be a power to reckon with among the directors because he's bound and determined to upgrade and improve himself, and he's no dumbbell. Furthermore, he's a perfect man to work with because he asks you, do you want to sell him your best, and then he lets you do what you think is your best. He doesn't tell you what he thinks your best ought to be, you know. And any director or producer who really wants to do himself a favor and is paying all this money to us guys who are supposed to know ought really to come to the point where he says, well, you know, if I'm paying them to know, then I'm going to buy what they give me because they're supposed to know. But they don't do that. They take what we give them and then they rewrite it, or they have, you know, they ask their kid or their wife or the preview audience, which knows nothing about anything. They would rather listen to a preview audience of Housewives in Phoenix, Arizona, than any 25 professional people who have been in this business for 30 years. They would prefer to listen to that opinion rather than ours, which I never have understood, never will. I don't. But that's not. I'm not the arbiter of the method of the the commercial industry.
You're talking about Josie Wales.
Right.
Would you like to talk? George talks more about the various
The aspects of the picture. Oh yeah, Josie is a picture that is a saga. I think we should get in now. Enough of this opinionizing to the technique that I use. You've talked. I got to tell you this, David. You've talked to more composers than I have. I don't talk to my colleagues about their methods, and I don't want them asking me about mine too much. But I have given a couple of seminars this year about techniques involved, and I have an approach to this that maybe somebody's interested in. And in order to talk about Josie, I have to talk about all of this. You know, what is a film score really? The first thing you have to decide is what is the task to be accomplished in relation to the film. The primary aim is to serve the picture. It's not to produce music that will stand on its own or be an album. But if you get that as a byproduct, hooray, good. But the primary aim is to serve the film. A motion picture score is part of a composite conglomerate entity. It is the score. Wait a minute, excuse me, shut it off, yes. Okay. We were talking, I believe, about the
I can
way...
play it back if you want to pause.
Yeah, well, I think I remember the way one approaches the job of scoring a film, the first task being to decide what is required. How do you know when you're through? And that you need two things. You have to look at it from several points of view. One is the kind of a thing it is. Is it a saga? Is it a story that covers a great deal of time? Is it an incident, something that happens in 36 hours? You know, does the music, is the film working to the degree that dramatically it requires no assistance, or does it? Does it need weighing one way or another, or manipulating, that is to say? Are there ambiguous portions which have to be clarified, or where you want to safeguard against the audience taking a wrong interpretation of something, or you want them to take a wrong interpretation of something? That's all manipulable. Um, is it a period picture? Is it a picture where the real estate wants to be played up, where you play simply the ambiance, the air, the color, the feeling of the thing, the scenery, in effect, as we did in the Wild Bunch largely? On the case of the Wild Bunch, it was two things. One, it was the period. Two, the place and the time, which was, definitely Mexico. And three, something to counterbalance what at that time appeared to be an overabundance of excessive violence. And it was for that time. No one had ever seen that on the screen before. So if you go back and look at the Wild Bunch again, the score is excessively schmaltzy. The violence needed no help from me. It was very much there and working. What it did need was humanizing, and the task there was simply for me to assist if I could in the slide from taking a group of gentlemen who came in Reel 1 and performed a reprehensible act for which you hated them, and cause you to have reason to weep when they died 2.5 hours later. And that's a long way to go. And you have to, you have to really do some warming up somewhere along the way in a very careful way to cause this to happen. I think it worked in that score. In the case of Josie, it was somewhat the same. The period was somewhat earlier. It was the conclusion of just after the end of the Civil War. Josie Wales happens to be a true story about a situation which really did happen but didn't get much publicity. There was a group of Southern soldiers who didn't surrender when the Civil War was over. And there was a senator, Jim Lane from Kansas, who had a regiment who continued to fight in the West, in the territories which were not yet states. And they continued to harass the American army in these outposts and to pillage and to plunder and do all kinds of things. I'm sorry, Jim Lane was it was a Northern Army. It was part of the Northern Army, the Union Army, which, on the guise of chasing Southern renegades who would not surrender, they did the pillaging. You understand what I'm saying? They went into the territories under the blanket cover of chasing a danger, a clear and present subversive danger. There were these Confederates who wouldn't give up, and they had to chase them. So they had to take regiments out there. On the way, they pillaged and robbed and stole and did all kinds of things, and they collected a lot of spoils. And it was a black page in the history of the behavior of the Union Army. All wars are replete with such stories, I'm sure. I mean, the rape of conquering armies is not anything which the Japanese or the Germans or anybody else has a monopoly on. I'm sure we've done our share. You want to change tapes, or you got enough? Okay. Anyway, the evolution marched along that way. The band started doing things, and pretty soon we started doing concerts in the Crescendo, what was then the Crescendo. The building isn't even there anymore. It's next to where the Playboy Club now is on Sunset Boulevard, or was. And Mort Saul was in there. Then we'd go in there on Monday nights. And then I got a show called the Saturday Night Review, which was a replacement for Sid Caesar. That show of shows, hour and a half live. You remember that, live. No tape, no nothing. The light went on, you're on the air for 1 hour and a half. And it was a variety show, very difficult, which I had to do all the writing for that. But, when a band plays this much, as we did in the buses, and there's no other answer to it. They got so good. They got to know each other so well, and they had such chops, and they got so clean and so fine, and their phrasing got so good, and we all knew everybody knew what everyone else was going to do. It was like baseball used to be. There were no stars. It was a good team, and boy, that band got so good. And we really we did a lot of things, and pretty soon some guy I knew with money came along and was looking for a loss, and bought the band and put it on. We had our own television show here for a year for Alden Holmes on Friday nights opposite the fights, and we didn't have much of an audience, but again, it was a hell of an experience. We had a boom camera and did some things. And Ruth Olay was singing with the band then. I had found her as a secretary someplace. And it was a hell of a band. We had Conrad Gazzo and Sam Donahue and Joe Howard and Maury Harris, old Joe Triscari. And good Johnny Williams was the piano player in that band for a while. And then we got, I don't know, we made those records then. And
How many were there?
well, we made several albums for Decca. Several. The Formula album, the Dance Concert album, quite a few. And no hits, though. You know, we were the progressive jazz era was upon us. Jerry Mulligan was becoming a big wheel. Bird had surfaced. Coltrane had appeared on the scene. Things were changing. Miles Davis. It was beginning to get a little weird, and they were stepping ahead of where people were.
When did the band break up?
That band was never a band as an entity. It was always a studio band that did things around here in between our other things. Monday nights we were at the Crescendo. Saturday nights we were usually in San Diego or Balboa. During the week, in various groupings of larger or smaller, we serviced our media work. Saturday we did the Saturday Night Review. Wednesday we did the Groucho Marx Show. Tuesday we did the Hardy Family. Thursday we did Chicken Every Sunday, whatever it was. We were working our butts off, but getting better all the time and braver all the time. Then there developed a hassle in this town in the struggle between the white and black unions. There were two unions here, a white one and a black one, which is something I never felt much about. I've always had a lot of social consciousness anyway. In my private life, I have interests, and as you may already have sensed, I got very deeply involved in this. I got involved in a movement to help guys over in the black community to work up to where they could take a place in the medium, and they had no experience. They weren't allowed. But there was a symphony organized over there, and I used to go over there a couple nights a week to work with guys to get them used to this kind of thing. I found two guys over there that really sent me up the wall. One was Buddy Collette, and the other was Red Callender. So I hired them. I hired them on the Groucho Marx Show, something you didn't do in those days. And I walked smack into the establishment. I said, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" It wasn't only the establishment, it was the union. And not only the white union, but the black union. They didn't want any integration. You know, they had very cushy jobs going with what they had. They didn't want the black union to disappear and meld into the white union or vice versa, because what happened to their little game they were playing? So we had a lot of opposition, and bitter and very angry and very dangerous opposition. The black union's fees were lower, their death benefits were lower, everything was just an unfair situation. But Groucho stood back of me on that one, even when we moved from CBS to NBC. And I kept those guys, and then when we got the Saturday Night Review on NBC, there they were too. For the first time in the history of this town, there were two black guys on television on a network-owned show. Had never happened before. Well, time marched on, and in 1953 I got subpoenaed for the Un-American Activities Committee for a series of activities of mine, of which that was only one. I had been warned. It was no big surprise. And I was what you call an unfriendly witness, and I was blacklisted in one day. I lost everything. And it was at that time that I had to turn into a band leader. That was in 1953. That year I do remember. I was unemployable in the medium, as was everybody who got burned by that. All my friends, and some who were not my friends. I went trying to figure out a way to earn a living. I started writing acts again, which I could still do, and Joe Glazer, who was an agent who booked bands, I contacted him about maybe going on the road for the summer in '54, last summer, that it turned out that there ever was a circuit because the ballrooms closed the next year. The coaxial cable went in, television was coast to coast, and there were no more ballrooms. But at that time, there still were. That was the year Billy May went out, and we were right behind him on that tour. And the road was still very much there for that kind of ballroom dancing. Rock, mind you, had not yet arrived. There was no discotheque thing, and it was, it was still there. And I went to New York and formed this band. He hooked up a tour with me and a group called the Gaylords, who had a hit record at the time, and a singer named Don Cornell. And we went out and did a combination concert and dance. 14 weeks without a night off. Started in New York, rehearsed for a month, put a whole new band together, a road band in New York with the same book. Worked like a dog. At about that time, the McCarthy hearings, the Senate hearings, were on television on that very summer. Joe Welch was making mincemeat out of Senator McCarthy, who came after the Un-American Committee. And the blacklist was beginning to crumble right then. But it was not that easy to step back on yet. It didn't go away like in a puff. That was an interesting summer because that too was a mixed band. There were 3 black guys in that band, and we had some interesting experiences on the road with that. Someday when we have time, I'll tell you, in certain of the Tom Archer ballrooms in the Middle West and in Ohio. But anyway, I finally got the experience of going on the road, this time as the leader with my own band, my own bus. And I had to put up with the fist fights and the fleas and all of the petty thievery and the nonsense that goes on with a tribe of pirates and gypsies who don't have any luggage. And one guy had no luggage, and the guys on either side of him sat farther away from him every night in the stand. But there was some interesting times we had. I will say that I wouldn't trade that summer for all the memories in the world for things that happened. The band was not a hit in New England, but by the time we got to Chicago, it had really fallen together and it started to wail. And when we hit the Northwest, it was roaring. And by the time we came down back out here for a week in this town, the guys were really playing, but they hated each other. But that doesn't matter. And then we did that whole summer, and one of the biggest thrills of my life was the last night we were out was at some hall in Oklahoma or somewhere in there. It was an American Legion Hall. I don't even remember the town. Private dance or a public dance in an American Legion Hall or an Elks Hall or something like that. And the band went on the stage without the book. They never took the music out of the bus. Played the whole goddamn night from memory. I want to tell you, for a guy, that's really a tremendous thrill for me. It was really, I took it as a kind of a big tribute in a way. And everybody, the thing that happened with bands that doesn't happen with rock groups is that the performance always happens as a concerted event where everybody's pitching at the same time. It isn't that the rhythm section comes on Thursday and lay down a track, and then 2 weeks later we'll come in and we'll add the ooh-ahs, and then we'll put, this in and that in, and see what we can build in the control room. There wasn't that. It was a performance done by those people in concert at the same time. It was an act, in other words. And we knew we were good. And all there was in life was traveling on that steamy bus, fighting with these people you were so sick of looking at you could throw up, drinking, getting to the job, playing the gig, getting back on the bus and going again. Trying to sober up and get rid of your headache, find a place to get your laundry done, and get on that stand night in and night out without pause. So you get to live for the moment when you get up on that stage, and for that 5 hours, you're king of the world in that little place. That little world, you're the king. Everybody's looking at you, and we were good, and we damn knew it. And when we got on that stage and started to do our thing, which was, by that time, I must say myself, quite spectacular. There was a feeling of self-confidence and cockiness and accomplishment that people don't often get to enjoy. And even guys in the band who did hate each other by that time, but depended on each other and needed each other. I think any one of them would have fought to the death to keep anybody from leaving because it would have ruined the section, And that kind of pride was what was indigenous and so much a part of the band era, which I find missing now. Uh,
Sounds like a good idea for a movie.
oh, it would make a great. Nobody's ever depicted that era as it should really be, because I must tell you, in my view, that the vernacular, the language, the style of living, the attitude towards the establishment, the drug culture, if you want to get down to it, where did all of it begin? But on those buses. The first hippies were on those buses, not in communes, man. You know, that phrase, that word I just said, man, you know. We did that in 1939. They caught up with us much later, you know. All of it began with that kind of jive business, what they used to call. But we were the avant-garde then. We were the first rebels. Not that that means too much, but I think it's worth documenting, is all I'm saying. As part of history, someone should write down what that era really was, because it's been misquoted and overglorified. I mean, you depict certain guys like Tommy Dorsey as angels. They weren't angels. They were very talented guys, and they were mean as hell. They were really rotten bastards, you come right down to it. But that's not the point, you know. None of us were angels. We were the roughest. I mean, you wouldn't want us in your house. I want to tell you that right now. None of us. But we did what we did, and we knew it, and a lot of the guys died very young. It was a hard life. They drank like fish and lived very hard, and for the most part, didn't have their interest never expanded beyond what they were doing. It was a total dedication, and many of them couldn't change and couldn't grow, and didn't, and it's a loss. Anyway, that was the period with my own band, that one summer tour with a band that was not a studio band, which also I made an album with that bunch. Had an entirely different sound than the studio band here. It was rougher in a way it was more exciting, and in a way it wasn't. It's hard to explain, but anyway, it blew apart like all of it does, and I was with my collecting my losses, and came back to town to figure where do I go from here. The band days were finished. There were no more ballrooms anymore. There weren't going to be. That was apparent. And, well, I went back to writing acts and albums for other people at the time. A lot of singers I recorded with. Didn't do bad. Wound up the following year in '55, Joe Glazer booked me into a new hotel in Las Vegas as a house conductor. I took up the seeds of the band we had here, plus some of New York, plus some extra guys, and went up there, and we went into what was then the Royal Nevada Hotel, no longer there. The building is there, but it's part of the Stardust now. And we had one hell of a show band in that place. The Treasury Department came through that year, and we were contacted to do a show for them. I knew my blacklist troubles, and I said I'd really rather not. I don't want to bother to go through a clearance with that grocer in Syracuse, you know. But the guys that owned the hotel kind of insisted, and we did the show for 30 weeks or something. The United States government as a sponsor, but I wasn't acceptable to Post Toasties. You know, it doesn't make any sense. Anyway, that's the way it went. I had good experiences there, too, because while I was at the Royal Nevada, the first Broadway show came intact into a nightclub. It happened to be Guys and Dolls, the original cast. Twice a night for 16 weeks. Boy, there's another experience I had not had, and I certainly got it there. And it was a good thing. And then, as all these things do, that hotel ran afoul of money troubles and went broke, owing me a lot of money, and fell apart. And there we were again. But by that time, you know, all of this was pointing towards the time when the blacklist was going to fall apart, as it had to, and it finally did. Incidentally, via Betty Hutton, for whom I had done a few nightclub acts by that time, who moved into television and simply pulled me with her. And she refused to take the nonsense that the others crumbled under, from, you know, Groucho Marx on. They all simply bowed down when everybody said, "We'll tell you who you can use," and they said, "Okay." I don't say any of them are particularly happy about having done it, but they did it. But she wasn't about to do that, and the time was ripe for somebody to resist anyway, and she was the one that did. And so I got my name back on the air again. Immediately after that, a friend of mine, a dear friend of mine who just died, and one of the original Hollywood 10, had already broken back in through Otto Preminger via a picture called Exodus that he'd written. Dalton Trumbo, that was. And he called and said, "You know, my friend Otto Preminger is about to make advise and consent, and I think if I talk to him, I can get that for you, even though you're in the dark. And I said that would be more than I could ever hope for, but he did it. And in 1960 or 61, I did advising consent, and I was back in the picture business, really in the picture business for the first time. That was my first major feature after 10 years or almost, well, 8 years of Blacklist struggling. Well, from then on, it's been another world. There's been no more dance bands. There weren't any anyway. That was all over. The rock thing came in. We went through the period of the Hilltoppers and early Billy Vaughn and early Dot Records, and all that came and went. And Big J McNeely, and then came Elvis, and then came the Beatles, and it went on so down the line to now. Stereo came in, and then multi-track, and 24-track, and 65,000 track, and all the other stuff. And I decided, the hell with that, I was going to go legitimate and become a serious composer in the films, which I have done from that time to this. I thumped along through various small movies and television shows, whatever there was, until I ran across Peckinpah sometime later when we did Noon Wine, which was a thing, and that was a fortunate occurrence because Sam and I have been kind of teamed up ever since. Now I've got a similar alliance, I think, with Clint Eastwood and certain other people for whom I have done repeated work. And I'm just bound and determined to improve the level of my output. I've gone back for the last 15 years to deep studying, largely on my own, and a great deal of experimenting, trying to evolve something of value out of all this, and trying now to establish respect for this as a craft. I think that, as I said at the outset of this discussion, that I felt the arts were in trouble, and I still feel they are, but I think one of the things that can save them is if we can keep them alive within the context of feeding, of doing their purposeful work of serving the media as it exists as best we can. In that sense, the only really important music that can come now is going to come out of the films, because there are no symphony orchestras supporting themselves. And even if they do, the boards of directors will not get rich by programming the works of new composers, because this isn't the Romantic era. Nobody comes, in a carriage for 200 miles to hear a first performance of a symphony by anybody. In fact, they stay away in droves until they read the review and find out how bad it is or what the reviewer thought. And they will, they'll go to hear Brahms' Second or something they well know, but they're not going to go to hear experimental works. So the films is it. And the film's a marvelous medium. I love the films, as I told you. There's a great opportunity to do great things there for composers and for audiences to pick up on. It just simply has to be correctly handled and protected from the usurers and the greedy ones who consider it a commodity instead of a piece of an art form. I've been nominated for an Academy Award 3 times. I am presently on the Executive Committee of the Music Branch and on the Board of Directors of the Guild and the Screen Composers. And I'm a steely and stiff fighter for principles of these kinds within the structure of the Academy and within the guilds and the other organizations. I don't always win. That I'm frequently a big pain in the ass to some people. But I guess I can't stop being Crusader Rabbit no matter what. A couple years ago I had 2 coronaries after staying up 9 days in a row trying to meet some series of television deadlines. And since that time, I've had to slow up a little and stop taking the amphetamines. We used to take Benzedrine pills like they were peanuts, but after a while it takes its toll. So I've had to cut out that kind of activity. I have to sleep a little at least every night now. I have regained my health quite well. There's no permanent damage. I'm not crippled or paralyzed or even, for that matter, incapacitated. I just have been warned that the time is long gone to live like an idiot and, keep running on a treadmill and pretend that I'm going to outrace everybody and that I'm made out of steel and iron when I'm not. Deadline fever is a problem every media composer has. It's both good and bad. And the best part of it is that in the last throes of trying to put a score together, when you have to face the clock on the calendar and see that there's so much left to do in so many days, and your head is just so full of ideas by now that you can't let them out. You can't get them down fast enough, but you can't sleep, and it's a total effort. You think of nothing else. There is nobody else. You don't know your children's names. You don't talk to your wife. You don't answer the phone. You don't eat. You don't do anything. You just sit here for days and fight like hell to make it as good as you can in the time that's left, and you hate yourself for having wasted so much time on the earlier things. That part is good. In the beginning of these jobs, for me personally, it's very difficult to get going because all those first decisions, as I said before, of design and style and structure, which have to be made, and you have to live with them. And when there's time to consider them, you'll use the time to consider them. Do I really mean this? Is there a way I could improve it? What if maybe I should try and see if, meantime, days go by, and you've lost them. And that's the thing that kills me, that I find is so debilitating physically. I know of no answer for it. I've not been able to conjure up that final euphoric state of high adrenaline in which my head is full of ideas I'm absolutely certain I want to get on the paper and there isn't time to put them down. I can't call up that state of mind early enough. That only seems to come to me under the pain of the last few moments of necessity, and I suppose I have to face the fact that one day that moment's going to come and I'm going to need that, and it isn't going to happen. And then what? I just hope I never see that, or that I develop somehow the means to hypnotize myself into being able to be more disciplined earlier. The trouble with being a media writer is that we all become deadline oriented. It's far better for any composer or painter or sculptor or author or anybody if you can discipline yourself, to just cut out all distractions a certain number of hours a day and be able to give it total concentration, and then through a period of decompression get rid of it and give your body and your mind a chance and then come back. I am unable to do that. I'm so trained the other way. Once I begin, any interruption is deadly. So I can't sleep, I can't do it, and that's what's so awful. It's both awful and wonderful at the same time. I say those are periods while I'm at my most miserable, I'm also at my happiest, because it's coming out easily, and it's painful and it hurts, but it's there, damn it, and that's what I want to do. I have not been successful in evolving a way to get it out any less painfully. I wish I could. If anybody has any ideas, I'm wide open.
I think right now let's just briefly mention some of the movies that you have done. We won't go into. Just to give them their names.
Well, the Sam Peckinpah pictures, if I can remember now, I'm really,
I don't,
yeah, well, perhaps you better get it out. I done The Wild Bunch, Straw Dogs, Junior Bonner. I did a score for The Getaway, but Steve McQueen didn't like it and went out. Sam, well, that's another whole story. My score to The Getaway, however, is not there. And I'm not happy about it. Neither is he, but that's the way it went. I then did Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, a disaster. Killer Elite, a disaster. And now we're coming up on Convoy, which I think I'm going to do. I don't know. He's asked me. I don't know if I'm going to be able to. With Clint Eastwood, I've done, working backwards, Josie Wales, The Enforcer and Josie Wales, and I'm set to do The Gauntlet, which is a very good picture, which he's presently shooting, which I start in July. Monday, I go up to see Michael Ritchie, with whom last year I did Bad News Bears, and on Semi-Tough, which I'm supposed to do. Then somewhere between those four, or five, three, whatever they are, I'm supposed to do Dog Soldiers with Carol Rice, which is also shooting in Mexico presently, and won't be ready until late summer, early fall. But Carol Rice, I did The Gambler with him a few years ago, a Jimmy Caan picture. With Michael Winter, I did Lawman, The Nightcomers, The Mechanic, Scorpio. What else? There was one other I can't remember. Anyway, those are the Michael Winter pictures, and they were all rather good, I thought. The scores, anyway, were among the best I've ever done. I did Super Cops with Gordon Parks. I did Demon Seed before this here. This year, I just finished Gray Lady Down for Walter Mirisch. Advise and Consent You Know About. What else? Oh my! Well, you got the list. I don't remember. I'm sure I'm forgetting something. It all runs together after a
You've
while.
done a lot of TV themes, just to throw some of the names of those out.
Well, I've done, yeah. Beginning, I suppose the most important is Hogan's Heroes, which has been on longest. These last few years, Macmillan has been a big mainstay. The Bionic Woman theme is mine. Andros Targets, which just was canceled, was mine. And the Chicago Teddy Bears, a very good show, I thought, was mine. And lots of movies of the week. I did a thing called Bridget Loves Bernie for a long time. Shows like He and She and The Good Guys and Run Buddy Run. Oh, I don't know. There's so many of them. They come and go so fast. And the specials, movies of the week, especially, you don't even mention them after a while. Once they're on, they're not there anymore. That's one thing I'm not too thrilled about. You kill yourself on a movie of the week, and it's on tape, and it's got to be erased, and it ceases to exist. Not so with a film. Frankly, I'm not too choked up about working in television as such anymore. I think it's the demands far outweigh the rewards, and I'm not only talking about monetary rewards because I know that there's no way that television could ever pay the kind of prices it ought to, but I'm talking about in terms of quality. There's never the time to do even a respectably decent job anymore. Used to be. There is no longer. By the time you get it, the directors and the producers have futzed around with it so long and jiggled and jabbed. All the time is gone. You've got 3-4. I'm telling you, we get 3-4 days to do 2-hour shows, and it's inhuman. What you come up with is a grab bag, and I don't have that kind of contempt for what I'm doing that I want to put that kind of product in my store window. I really don't. I'm not some novice newcomer who's just, if you spell my name right, I'm happy. No, wrong. If I don't like what I do, I'm happy. I don't care what anybody else thinks of it. And if it isn't the way I like it, then I don't want it on there. And that's getting very, very difficult in television to maintain a standard. Very difficult. So, what else can I tell you?